point perspective going on here.
Oops, did not.
What do you guys think?
Try it. I mean, if you're comfortable, I think it's hilarious because Corey's got a corner behind him. I've got a corner. You should find a corner.
All right, I'm going to the corner.
It'd be awesome.
Going to the corner. Let's see
So we are officially streaming right now, even though we've got a minute before the show actually starts.
Okay.
So let me just say hi to everyone. Hey guys, if you're watching right now on YouTube, good to see you. If you're watching right now on Integral Live, which again is integrallife.com/live, there's a link right underneath the video player that'll bring you into the Zoom app. And then if you have any questions or comments for Diane or Rob during the show, that's where you need to be in order for us to see them. And once you're in there, you have two ways that you can interact with us. You can either raise your hand, which tells us that you want us to turn on your camera and we can have some real time back and forth, or you can hit the Q&A button and submit a written question that we'll read on the air and respond to that way. So two different ways you can interact with us, but you need to be on the Zoom app in order to do it. So come join us here. And I'll repeat all this when it's actually time to open this up to the audience, but just for everyone joining us in the pre-show, I thought you might like to know.
I'm dissatisfied with my corner. I don't think it looks as cool as Rob.
I like your corner.
You do?
I like your corner too. It's looking good.
Okay, good.
I like how we're all symmetrical with each other.
We're all cornered.
Although I did do a call from where you are now, Di, and people thought I was doing a call from the sauna.
From prison? Oh no, from the sauna.
From the sauna, yeah.
That's really funny. That is really funny. It's so good. I love that. I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
From the sauna.
That's how we get an audience, guys. Live from the sauna.
There you go. Live from the sauna.
Let's do it.
All right. So I'm just waiting for this thing to catch up. And then let me pull my notes in front of my face. All right. Here we go. Hey, guys.
Hey.
Diane and Rob, good to see you.
It's good to see you, brother.
Hey, it's great to see you too, Corey.
Yeah, here we are for episode number 4 of Integral Justice Warrior. And we got a special guest today. We have Mr. Rob McNamara. Rob, good to see you, man.
It's a pleasure to be here.
It's, I'm really excited. I'm just really happy that you were able to join us today because, Diane and I, last month, we had this really great conversation about climate change, and particularly around, a problem that I think a lot of us feel, which is just sort of how to overcome this general sense of paralysis and maybe even powerlessness that, again, a lot of us are feeling around the climate change problem, just because it's such a, again, it's such a big problem, and there doesn't seem to be like an easy lever anywhere that I can pull to try to move us towards any kind of solution. So it feels just very out there, and we're just kind of getting impacted by this. And it's generating a lot of anxiety for us, I think both individually and collectively. And in fact, we had a caller last month who had a really, really great term for this. She described a sense of anticipatory trauma, which I think is a really great phrase and is just completely accurate in terms of what a lot of us are feeling. And, when it comes to climate change, Ken Wilber famously said that climate change, he described it as the bodhisattva vow of the 21st century. And I've always really loved that framing because it, not only really, I think, foregrounds the urgency of the problem, but it also, I think, sort of involves the elegance that's required in order for us to even begin to solve it, really to even begin to talk about it, let alone solve it. So, if we're going to talk about elegance, I can't think of anyone better to talk to than the author of The Elegant Self, Rob McNamara. So
It's good and awesome, man.
I'm excited to have you on there. Is that a good plug? You like that?
That was amazing. Yeah.
So, again, last month, Diane and I were talking about how really important it is for us to find some way, I think, to make an impact, whatever that impact might be, wherever you might be able to make it within your own sphere of influence. And, that impact can be big or small. It can be loud. It can be quiet. And it can really land anywhere in the 4 quadrants. I mean, we can talk about new behaviors in the upper right quadrant. We can talk about embracing new technologies or getting involved with campaigns like planting trees in the lower right quadrant. It can land as, being able to facilitate dialogue and cultivate political will in the lower left quadrant. And of course, when it comes to how each of us are holding this individually, it all really kind of begins with and flows from our upper left quadrant experience, just trying to find ways to sort of align our practice and our inner experience with, you know, a particular set of views and values and sort of this holistic vision of what this world could look like if we were able to actually get on top of the climate change problem. You know, all of which is, I think, our efforts to try to reduce suffering sort of wherever we see it and however we can. Which, you know, I think really means that all of us need to be leaders here, really. We all need to find ways to sort of strengthen our resolve and overcome our fears and really start to engage the world with an almost kind of unflappable integrity, while finding more agile and more skillful ways to communicate with people who might be enacting this problem in a very different way than, you know, than we are. And of course, you know, Rob and Diane, both of you guys have just so much experience in terms of helping people to sort of forge these leadership skills and these communication skills to build bridges between people and really to help people bring their gifts more fully into the world. So I'm really excited, you know, to hear what you guys have to say about this today.
Great. Yeah, we're really happy to be here too. It's great to be with both of you. Corey and Rob and I all met about the same time. We all came to work for Integral Institute and for Ken Wilber's vision of how to get the integral framework out into the world and to identify integral consciousness as this potential capacity to be able to see the truth of all perspectives and to start to integrate and work with more, you might say, more expansiveness, more nuance, and and more complexity, and that has its own challenges. But it's been a really, what I appreciate personally is just that we're still working together after all this time. You know, how is it that we're still together? It's 2019. So 15 years we've been on this project. And Rob and I have turned our attention to climate change. He and I practiced together in the Zen tradition. And, you know, obviously Rob was, I think, one of Ken's early assistants and has been very deeply informed by integral theory. And he's done a tremendous amount of work on embodiment and on integral life practice, you know, so working with these dimensions of practice, including cognition and spiritual practice, embodiment, and also psychology or the psychodynamic element, which is one of the things that doesn't get integrated very well into our climate change discourses. And so we decided for our Zen study and practice this fall, that we would focus specifically on climate change. And we discovered that within our student group, of which there are probably 80 people on the course, that there are a lot of people that are actually on the ground working, who are integralists, like on sea rise, on the carbon tax, on reforestation, on decarbonization. So we started inviting these 10-minute TED Talks from people who actually had substantive knowledge. So if you're somebody who's listening right now and you have substantive knowledge, our hope is to actually give you an opportunity to share, because integralists are doing a lot of work right now and we're trying to create a conversation that we can all participate in. The other thing that's really, really important to us is what comes from a contemplative or a meditation practice in the way of a deep connection to being, an ability to encounter fear and to become fearless, and also to experience unity in relationship to something that's extremely complex and large. And so that's one thing that Rob and I want to touch in today. So we're going to use integral theory to start to look at climate, and then we're going to end our session by working with meditation and its role in terms of our work, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. Beautiful. So how does that sound? Rob, is there anything you want to add in terms of just framing and what we're hoping to do today, or why we're doing this?
Well, I think my aspiration is kind of an unreasonable, compassionate embrace of our situation. So if we can discover contours of that together, that would be exquisite. So that's kind of my orienting intention that I'm bringing personally. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Great.
Awesome. And before we jump into it, I just want to mention, Rob, you were actually the first integral guy, integral I met when I moved to Boulder in 2000 with the single intention to just crash the integral party. And that's literally what I did. We found Rob was having, this is when you were living in Ken's old house in Red Hill. You were having a birthday party, and we found a flyer for it at Naropa.
That one
and I was
was
like,
epic,
oh my
man.
God, we have to go. This is my opportunity. And we totally did. We didn't know anyone there, and we crashed your party, and you were the first guy I talked to. And you gave me just such like a nice, warm welcome and embrace. And, you've always just, you've been an important character in my own story.
Hey,
all these years. So
thanks for crashing the party. It wouldn't have been the same without you, man.
And here we are all these years later.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So that's it. Let's just hand it over to you guys, because I really want to see what you're bringing to the party today.
Great. So, like many of you who are on the call, I've had my own relationship to the environmental movement, to climate change, climate, what do we say, crisis and climate catastrophe, depending on my mood. And I've also attended a lot of events on my own out in the world, never an integral event, but events mainly related to political action and also to climate science. And one of the things that I have found challenging and to some degree frustrating is to get a lot of information about the science, whether it's related to sea ice, whether it's related to emissions or global temperatures, and to receive really devastating news into the room with a very objective and scientific atmosphere, and with a complete disregard for what the emotional impact is on people, and without regard for what people take away, and lots of times without regard for what people can actually do. That could be. Our intention is really to use the integral frame and to use Ken's guidance to really start to look at this issue and see what the framework could offer. So we thought today we would like to just take a kind of a very light cruise, if you will, through the 4 quadrants and some of the dimensions that arise within the map that are really, really important to our personal understanding, to the conversations and the discourses we participate in, and to whatever individual or collective political action we choose to take. And that's something that we want to continue to talk about. So I think we could begin maybe in the 3 of us could riff together on just the upper left. Yeah. And what is it that goes on in our individual interiors when the topic of climate comes up, when we're reading about it or we're listening or we're attending these kind of meetings that I've been describing. And maybe, Rob, if you want to start with some of what arises for you, and then we can kind of maybe between the 3 of us just note some of what goes on that really needs our attention. It's a very diverse situation. It's a very diverse ecology, if you will, the 4 quadrants of climate. So what do you notice, Rob, in your upper left?
Well, as usual, death is what pops up most vividly, and I taste this particular challenge most vividly through my children. And I feel like I've had the privilege to live just an amazing life surrounded by amazing people such as yourselves, and just had the privilege and opportunity to pursue and to give my life force to things that I really love with immense generosity and abundance around me. And there's deep uncertainties in terms of what is to come for future generations. So I really feel that personally. And then there's also
the confrontation with uncertainty and the confrontation with impermanence, both.
Right, both. Yeah. And then Corey, you mentioned it around just this powerlessness, right? That this is such a complex system, and there's so many different variables and so many different contributing factors that nobody has control over it. And it's very distinct from the existential threats that were started to kind of make their way into our individual psyches in the 50s with the advent of nuclear weapons. And we, in psychology, we thought we were going to be starting to work with that more rigorously, but this is part of what Diane and I have been in conversation with, is that conversation never fruition, and And so that as the Cold War ended, we the entrenched denial of death reigned, right? And now this is kind of a second wellspring where there isn't an agent, right, or there isn't a country that has, launch codes and buttons that could, potentially end things. Now it's all of us are implicated one way or another. And so I feel just my own personal, like being a part of something that nobody can control nor nobody can understand. And like, how do I feel about that? You know, and this is where I hope that we get to explore today. But when I look at the conditioning of Rob that is organized against his own death and wants to maintain control and wants to live in a certain predictive life and wants to kind of have, maximize my personal experience, while I'm here, all those things are like dead ends for me. Like,
Yeah, in other words,
yeah,
that what did Ernst Becker call it? Your own personal immortality project is being challenged.
yeah, that it's just doesn't work, and so it continually. So, um, one last thing that I would share in terms of my first person, my interior, is like I turn towards you, Di. I turn towards our practice. I turn towards like, uh, yeah. So that's a little bit of my first person. Yeah.
Yeah. How about you, Corey? What occurs for you in your own interior?
Yeah. I find that I oscillate really between sort of these two poles that I might call sort of hopelessness and hope. And they both sort of land in really, really strong ways for me. And sometimes I feel like I can even hold them both at the same time, even though they usually kind of cancel each other out. But, the hopelessness comes from, well, it comes from everything that I said when I set up and introduced the call today. I mean, it does come from this sense of powerlessness. It comes from this sense of it's just so far out of my hands. There's nothing I personally can do to make this any better for my kids. And Rob, you nailed it when the game changed when I had a family. The minute I had a family, all of this became so much more real than it ever had been before, because there was so much room more there was more room for denial before you have kids. You're like, oh well, yeah, this is all going to shit, but I'm going to be dead before the shit hits the fan anyway. So there you have a certain amount of outs, and as soon as you have your kids, I mean, you really have to reinvest yourself in these long-term solutions, and that's actually where my hope springs from. Particularly, it feels a little bit, I don't know, weird, but my hope grows as we continue to see the effects of climate change, because for the most part, for most people, climate change has been, largely an abstract conversation that was more about, a person's values, for example, than it was about real world sort of consequences. And now those consequences are starting to show up. We're starting to see, what the effect of our climate change dilemma really is. And I have a faith, this sort of faith in emergence, that as soon as we start feeling the heat, as soon as we start feeling the consequences of a changing environment, well, that's when our evolutionary gears start sort of, moving again. That's when sort of this slumbering giant can start to wake up for the first time in a generation. And hopefully at that point, we'll be able to make some pretty, be able to take some pretty large steps. In the process, it's this sort of dialectic between the hope that I feel and the amount of suffering that needs to still be generated before we actually cultivate the political will required to start doing something about this. And then the last thing that I noticed with myself is just how the conversation intersects with both my own personal sense of meaning making. In other words, I feel like I've sort of hit a ceiling with my own meaning making, and I can't really go much further until I start bringing this stuff into my practice and more fully into my heart.
Yes,
And
I
this
think
is
that's true.
yeah, and I'm hoping that this is the intersection where, you know, like we said just a minute ago, all three of us have really bent our lives around, you know, in sort of different ways around this integral thing. And it's my hope continues to be that all of this work that so many of us have been putting forward over the last, you know, decade or two is going to bear fruit as sort of, you know, the problems that call integral solutions into being in the first place are beginning to actually manifest themselves. The life conditions are
Yes.
here, and this is where we can actually start to find some real traction for these big, beautiful ideas that we've been so enamored with for so many decades.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Corey. And the main thing that I heard in what you said is that the polarity of hopefulness and hopelessness, which is a state experience that has probably cognitive and emotional dimensions. I also heard you say that the firsthand experience of the pressures of climate, the way in which individuals included start to experience those changes, galvanizing or waking us up in all four quadrants so that we had the political will and the what it takes to sustain these kinds of movements to make the change on this kind of level. So thank you for that.
Yeah,
And
I
I
feel so heard
also,
right
I
now.
mean, I would, yeah, great. It's one of the things we practice in this conversation is really hearing each other. And then for me, I think the question of, so if I look into my own interior, um, the the way in which I process the just incredible amount of information. I mean, if I were to just think casually about the number of articles I read per day related to climate, it's probably between 1 and 5 per day. And then that's just casually. But if I'm actually trying to read things for a particular purpose, then I can really, increase that. And sometimes it's difficult for me to know how to use that information. I feel like I forget a lot of it, actually. You know, I have some really core things in my mind around Earth temperatures, around carbon emissions, those kinds of things. But basically, it's hard for me to know what to do with that. So information is one thing in my own interior. The emotions that you were describing, both of you, but mainly of fear and uncertainty, of anger, in terms of the kind of self-righteous anger that comes up in relationship to getting out of the Paris Accord, for instance. You know, just the anger that arises around, you know, the fossil fuel drilling going on, or the unrelenting need, of the fossil fuel industry to continue doing what it's been doing for a long time in the face of all this information. So not to say that every company has. Some of the financial choices that are made. So there's this righteous indignation, this anger that arises, and then also grief. And I think Joanna Macy has probably done the best job of anybody I'm aware of really framing and creating a container for people to really feel the experience of grief. So I think those emotions are really important. And from a contemplative perspective, any emotion is filled with energy. You say any emotion has the mind of enlightenment, is the mind of enlightenment. And what are each of those, what is the importance of the fear? What is the importance of the anger? What's the importance of the grief? And how does it put us more deeply in touch with what we need to experience? I think on the other side of the street, for my individual self, part of the trouble of the individual is so much responsibility is placed on the individual. And yet we know from our research and from our engagement that our individual efforts need to be made in relationship to large collectives in order to have the kind of impact that we want. So sometimes I feel lonely, and I feel also existentially by myself. And I think that's partly why we're having this conversation. You know, after all these years, I've been kind of thinking about these things for a really long time. But it's important within the integral community that we start talking about it. In terms of also my own interior, I would say I've noticed a couple of things that are kind of awesome. One is I've noticed my genuine appreciation for life change. I mean, I have many more deliberate moments of appreciating a really rainy day out here in the desert, or appreciating when the pines feel like they've had a big drink and they're really full of water, versus long hot summers where they're not getting that kind of drink. I really noticed that. I noticed the storm systems and the way they've changed. I noticed how they used to regularly roll in from the south rain in the afternoon and then roll out. And now on any given day, they might come in from all 4 directions, so I'm much more in touch in a certain way with my own environment because of this. And I would also say, in my own interior, my relationship to scale and complexity is changing. And I'm really, really interested in that. And that's one of the things I think we can talk about in this group that's super important, is that I don't think just in terms of weather. I think in terms of climate and geologic change and evolutionary time and historical patterns. And that's a shift that has come from climate in terms of my own interior. So those are some other things that I think are important for us to create space for when we have our climate conferences and when we have our dialogues, and maybe there'll be an integral conference at some point. But just being able to feel the sensation of love for the natural world. Because there's nothing like death or impermanence to give you a sense of appreciation, how precious this life is. So those are some things that also arise within my own interior. And if I can manage my fear, and if I can relax with my fear, I'm pretty fascinated by what the transformative power of this situation is for us. And we can talk about transformative learning, because we've all been engaged in transformational learning since 2004. And how do the lessons we learned in seminars apply to this? So that's a big question for us. So that's kind of just some of the things that we think about in the upper left and how to work with that in conversation. And if you're listening to the podcast, think about what's most vivid for you in your upper left. And when we get to the Q&A, we can pause for a few minutes and see what comes up for you. So should we move to the lower left, or would you like to go to the upper right?
No, let's go lower left end, because there was something in what you were talking about that I think sort of naturally brings us into a discussion of the lower left, which is when you were talking about this sort of the pressures that are created by this almost oppressive sort of individualism that we celebrate in this culture. It's an individualism that, you could make a damn good argument has been sort of alienated from our collective responsibilities. And a lot of people, when they're talking about this, when they're trying to sort of, all of our upper left experiences are taking place within sort of these lower left waters. And we can't always see those lower left waters for what they are. It's hard to make those sort of shared subjects into objects.
Absolutely. I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
So I went to my grandchild's first grade presentation. And what was so interesting to me, I'm an American. I grew up in a school system that put a lot of emphasis on the individual, but I was a little bit blown away by how often the support of the individual child, their spontaneity, their creative expression, their uniqueness, even when they were doing music, it was the individual solos that they featured as opposed to the coherence of the whole group. And at the same time, they had a toolbox that includes all your left-hand quadrant social skills, like listening skills and patience and forgiveness and all these social skills, but it wasn't embedded in a framework that valued the commonality of the classroom. All the emphasis was on the individual, and that's what you're talking about. It's like we just take for granted the collective,
right?
But it's like absurd, the extent to which we do that.
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of people, when we're having these kind of conversations in integral spaces, a lot of people like to point to, something like neoliberalism as a way to describe these waters that we've been swimming in for decades and have such a hard time finding any sort of real distance from. They so permeate just how we think about ourselves and how we think about our civic responsibilities and how we think about, things like democracy. I mean, I think we're starting to see the corrosive effects of hyper individualism on democracy, which then sort of triggers a whole new set of fear. Okay, well, is democracy well equipped enough to deal with a problem as large and as systemic as climate change? Or do we really need some sort of like benevolent dictatorship in order to get us through this? And I think that, this neoliberalism, I've talked to Ken about this before. We've sort of tracked it as, you can see it even in something like the human potential movement, which in the 1970s, that's really how it started, as a human potential movement. And then that human potential got increasingly colonized by these sort of neoliberal impulses. So it went from the, human potential in the 1970s to sort of self-help in the 1980s. And then in the 1990s, it turned into, you know, sort of like self-branding and self-efficiency and things like that. And then in the 2000s, we got like Inbox Zero and, you know, all of these sort of like Seth Godin's kind of productivity type teachings, all of which is using the language of human potential, but in a very, very different way than it was being used in the 1970s, which was much more about sort of, you know, what's coming down the line for you? What are your untapped gifts that you have to offer to the rest of us? And it sort of got increasingly individualized, increasingly capitalized to a certain extent. And of course, you know, we're just a sort of a frog in the boiling water. It's hard to see these cultural changes as they happen until enough time has passed. And you can really say, wow, this, you know, the space that we're all sort of sharing together has really, really changed a lot in the last 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, to think and work with climate change from an individual perspective, as they say in Tibetan Buddhism, is like transferring the load of an ox to a cow. You know, it's just, it's not the main place we should be doing it. But Rob is going to talk about this right now. Our biggest challenge in the lower left, the science, the technology, the innovation, the goodwill, the, you know, best practices. We have what we need to address this issue. What we don't have are the skills in the second person. Our competition and our rivalry undermines everything. So I'm going to turn that over to Rob for just a minute to talk a little bit about the problem of second person, the potentiality of second person. It's really where the you could say the rubber meets the road of this challenge is in the lower left. It literally is not so much in the right-hand quadrants. Rob, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'd love to. I think one of the things that I constantly hear, and it's just this odd paradox, which is, you know, I want to have an impact, which particularly in this context, right? It's like, I really want to have an impact on climate change. And it's like, okay, like, let's look at that cultural, like the fabric that kind of holds that meaning making and that collective intention. Like, yeah, like let's make an impact together. And here it's totally the opposite, right? Which is our intent might be better suited to actually not have an impact or not have as great of an impact, right? But just to kind of get at how deeply ingrained individualism is, think back in school, right? Where your sole purpose during the test is to see what has been kind of memorized in your studies, right? And you're not allowed to look at your neighbor's paper, right? And that the entire system is set up such that if you do better than the person next to you, right, you have access to more resources. You can get into better schools. You can get those, you know, like, and so at a very rudimentary level, we're ensconced in a system, a culture that prizes that individual and pits us against each other. And this isn't just education. I mean, it's, you know, Diane talks about this often, like this is our, you know, we have such a DNA synergy, right, with just like the chimps, you know, like, and they're very oriented around their hierarchies, and we're very similar, right? But we've built an educational ecosystem that,
And domination.
exactly, yeah, domination. This thematic of who's winning, who's one up, who's one down, is just so deep into our ecosystem. And so when we look at a hyper object, right, it's not who has the best perspective. It's not even who has the most complex perspectives, because even the most complex perspectives can't even get close to comprehending the complexity that's involved, which means that by necessity, we need a different fundamental presupposition around what is the human being and who are we together. Because right now, those questions, as they're currently answered, are fundamentally built on this individualism that puts us against each other, which is, and this is what we run into around the issue of expertise, right? As we get into these conversations, and we're trying to have a conversation about climate change and how to advance things in a meaningful way. And what's really going on is people are just negotiating of who's one up.
Yeah, that's right.
And we are not at all getting at the underpinning of changing the culture and changing the psychology and the collective, such that we're coordinating our efforts together in new ways, in better ways.
Right.
Because that's one of the answers of this lower left is so critical. If we do not figure out how to answer the questions of what are we and what are we together, right, in a way that's generative of deep cooperation that gets us out of one up, one down dynamics, it's kind of game over. At least that's what some of the experts are saying.
Yeah.
So our individual sovereignty is so important, right? And it's an essential asset that needs to be protected in some ways as an object that is both holy and powerful and exquisitely beautiful, and it can be leveraged and manipulated and exploited,
Yeah.
and that's kind of what we're seeing in our world today, which is that sovereignty is slipping away from more and more people, and choicefulness is not actually present.
Yeah.
And so how do we reverse those things? And it's not something that we can do individually. Right? We actually need each other if we're going to foster a more generative sovereignty that can make better choices. And at the heart of it is, can we cooperate in more elegant ways, right?
Yeah.
And how do we coordinate those cooperations in such a way that the answer of what are we together is something other than what we have today? So that was a bunch. And
beautiful points, Rob. And particularly as we're talking about the challenges of hyper individualism on the one hand, and then we also have some fairly unique challenges in the lower left quadrant, which is sort of this fragmentation and balkanization of shared reality itself, right? I mean, it used to be 500 years ago, most people had a shared reality, and that reality was dictated by some authority like the church or what have you. For 500 years, we've had the shared reality that was enacted by things like the scientific method, and things became verifiable.
Our interpretive frames were highly similar.
Yeah, exactly. And, in the media age, and from, let's say, the 1950s till like really the 1980s or 90s, we had a shared reality that was based on a small number of media personalities who were sort of like the referees that would say, this is newsworthy, this is not. And it was very few channels, and it was all very centrally controlled. And we come up with 1,000 criticisms about why that can go bad real quickly. But as soon as the internet arrived, things changed really dramatically. And we find ourselves in the situation we're in today, where shared reality is so difficult for us to find with each other. Whether we're talking about our favorite TV shows like, something like Seinfeld, or we're talking about these actual views and values and visions that we need in order to solve problems as complex and as big as something like climate change. So we've got a lot sort of working against us in that lower left quadrant. Some of it is coming from this overemphasis of hyper-individualism in the upper left. Some of it is coming from just media changes, the way information moves changes in the lower right. And all of these things create feedback.
And there's domination and submission structures in our evolutionary history that primates have really strongly. So the whole domination, submission, and there's a lot of people who, the conversation about climate is a conversation about social justice. And we have to look at the ways in which we dominate each other with our worldviews and our sense of what is okay to be at the table and what isn't. For
That's right.
some scientific people want to dominate faith-based communities. Faith-based communities want to dominate LGBTQ communities. I mean, it's like this impulse to exclude is really, really deep. On the other hand, I think that what we can understand, and this has been something I've been giving a lot of my attention to as a Zen teacher and a mediator, is just simply getting more sophisticated about the relationship of sameness, commonality, unity, and coherence,
Yep.
differentiation, difference, excitement, and threat. And how do we, in our meetings and in our activities, how do we actually bring the understanding of building commonality and coherence and helping people develop a flavor for it so they understand how necessary coherence is to flow states, because effortlessness, timelessness, selflessness are properties of high coherence in groups. And how do we help people move out of this highly, highly individuated way of being, where difference is privileged to the point that nobody can agree on any kind of activity? And so can we start to work with our groups in such a way that we use difference to excite and catalyze and grow people, and we use our deep commonalities as humans, but our deep but energetic coherence, and then our unity to create deeper and deeper bonds. So I think that we do have what we need to be able to work with it. It's just a question of creating the proper kinds of processes and structures. And that's actually a big deal. And that's something we've been highly engaged in for a long time. In our integral facilitator program, we work with that a lot.
Right.
Yeah, and then in the Zen Sangha context, it's for me been a place of refuge, as we've been talking about, because here's a culture and a context where difference and diversity is embraced explicitly and overtly, and we're encouraged to kind of inhabit it, and to then bump into those places where conflict, the diversity gives rise to conflicts, which animates nervous systems and fear and aggression and hostility and anger. Like all those things are actually included, such that we have a felt experience that is okay, and we know the pathway through, and that's like, one of the things that very few people have, right? Usually they're, given the context of we're constantly being pit against each other, and it's a simple one up, one down structure. But when we start working with conflict in a way that is transformative, such that we both get to be one up, one down, and we get to become something else together, right? Nobody gets to preserve their position as the one up and the other person's the one down.
Yeah, I've been in situations where I was really trying to avoid being one down, and Rob just let me know, you're one down right now. Just there and love it, because everybody sees it.
See, everyone needs a referee.
Yeah, absolutely. And everybody needs to let you know when you've been defeated.
And who gets
we all have...
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Rob.
Well, and like that's it. I mean, as a student, right, who's welcomed to be one up, and to have a teacher learn from the student in a really sincere and generous way, that like changes me. Like I'm a different human being. I can only imagine the warfare that would be unfolding if you weren't like that.
I'd be losing for sure. But the other thing is that
we'd all be losing.
We're all defeated by that which is greater than we are. This is so much bigger than we are. That's what's crazy about it. And I think Rilke has that quote. I don't remember what the first word is, but something, it's, basically is something. Our enlightenment is the willingness to be defeated by greater and greater beings, which is beautiful. And so what kinds of contexts are we working in? The one upside, again, of the internet is that we're connected now across space and time. We can connect expertise. We can have these, look at what we're doing online right now. This is super awesome and crazy. We can just decide to have a conversation, and it's not even held within an institution. And it's incredible, the freedom that we have to explore in the directions that we need to explore. So the lower left is also, it's where so much of our work is. I mean, the rubber meets the road in the lower left. Absolutely.
That is sort of.
Want to go to the upper right?
That's
Yeah, go ahead.
total. I was just going to say it's sort of the irony of our technology today is that you're right. There is this underlying connection that allows us to have these pockets of sort of discord in the first place. So it's only through this sort of this literal. I mean, we are electronically connected to each other at all times, which is a miracle of the human species in so many ways, which gives us the luxury of finding all sorts of ways to disagree with each other.
So many ways to disagree. And can we be equally as interested in how we can agree and notice what that feels like when we become one with each other?
That's right.
Because differentiation is exciting, oneness is super soothing.
Right.
Super soothing and restful.
Well, should we jump up to the upper left, or should we kind of go through the circuit to the, because I'm really interested not only in looking at each of these quadrants individually, but how they influence and shape each other.
What's your impulse, Corey?
Well, my sense is let's go lower right, because as a perfect example of that, we're talking about how our sense of shared reality has changed so much over the last really 20 years since the internet came online, and how much of that change has largely been unconscious to us, right? And a big part of that is simply because the lower right quadrant technologies changed, and culture and consciousness are kind of like a gas that expands to fill the shape of whatever container you put it in. That's sort of what we're seeing to our own consciousness and to our own cultures with this massive lower right quadrant shift into these sort of more postmodern informational technologies. And it's been an absolute blessing in so many ways. I mean, I've been able to build an entire integral career based on the fact that in something like an internet exists. I mean, it's amazing. We've been able
to. It's really true. Well, Ken is the person that introduced, I mean, his website, Integral Naked, was my introduction to being online and finding online community and finding online learning. I mean, that's where it all started for me. I was using a computer, but I wasn't online until I met Ken.
Right. That's right. Seriously. And Rob, you're the same age as me, right? I'm 42. I think you're about 40 or so.
42, brother.
So we are of this really interesting generation who had a fully analog childhood and a fully digital adulthood. I mean, I got onto Netscape and when I went to college in 1995, and that was my first taste of the internet. So, it's interesting to look at how this sort of feels to us generationally as well. And then Diane, you're a little bit older than us, not by much, but just a little bit. And so you've probably got
super older. Ken and I were up on that end of the spectrum.
I was going to say, you had a few years on us.
I got a few years on you, believe me.
But I'm guessing that unfolding feels different for you because you have, more of your formative years were without all of this digital technology, and then it just sort of landed.
I mean, I literally got an email account when I was in my early 30s, and I went to work in the justice system in the courts, and the courts had their first email, and I started using email. And when I met Ken, and that was in the late 90s, and then when I met Ken and you all I started listening to Integral Naked probably in 2003. And so that's when it transitioned from using a computer and word processing and Excel and all of that to actually being online. And that was a big, big shift at that point, So I think one of the things we can say about the lower right is that everybody who is engaged with integral theory has some kind of understandings of systems and of the complexity, and is to some degree a systems thinker. And when we start thinking systemically and we think about how all these, everything from the systems within the natural world, if you will, fisheries and waterways and, soil and, forest floors and the way in which a pine forest, the complexity in that, you think about those systems. And then we think about systems like the fossil fuel system or the banking system or let's even go bigger. Let's take capitalism altogether. Yep. And, sometimes people say it's actually insufficient to focus on climate change, that the way all these systems are interacting is indicative of a much greater phase shift.
Right.
And that, that what we're about to encounter is so radical on so many levels related to these big systems that one can't change without all the rest of them changing at once. Right. But say something about that? No, we've been listening to, we've been Schmachtenberger and Beckstein, thinking about, these kind of meta take on this as well as Ken. What do you want, Rob, to the lower right?
Well, you're speaking right into it in terms of democracy and capitalism as main drivers, and the one that's probably most popular and has the most kind of discourse is looking at capitalism and what is a post-capitalistic society and what does a post-democratic society look like, and now we're starting to get into kind of civilization design, but clearly what's emergent isn't structurally represented yet. And kind of the kind of operationalization, and Corey, you're talking a little bit about this, of the human being, which is, these metaphors that are kind of in our culture and in our psyches that get kind of systemically played out, which is that we're a machine, or your mind is like a computer. It totally isn't, but we think about it, and that impacts our own self-understanding. And we even talk about processing, and and these kind of invisible metaphoric reference points are then played out, where we literally, get tastes of liberation via, getting more money, and that's a huge distortion, right? We talk about movement towards equity, right? And it's like economically represented, and we now have the human being that's reduced, humanity gets truncated and collapsed into an economic vehicle, right? And of course we're straddling
productive.
Yeah, are you a productive adult, digging yourself out of debt or responsibly creating debt to keep you kind of in this ecosystem, right? And this is all, highly interwoven with just how ferocious consumption is.
It's all part of that sort of that neoliberal slide where things like extrinsic value gets weighed way more than any sort of intrinsic value, where our public sphere activities are so much more valued than our private sphere activities, where we really get reduced to almost a smear of what a human being actually is, something that can be calculated and measured and all of that. And it has a dehumanizing effect on us. And, one of the characterizations of that neoliberal slide that I've heard before that I really like is, in the 1960s, Timothy Leary was walking around America giving people acid, telling them, tune in, turn on, drop out. And now 50 years later, people are microdosing LSD as a way to increase their productivity in Silicon Valley and earn more money. Right. So, I mean, the entire psychedelic impulse has in a certain way been co-opted by these drives, which is just kind of funny.
Yeah. And this is, I mean, just to talk tech, these are the basic questions. Does your inbox bring your greater humanity out?
Right.
Or does it collapse it? And the answer is pretty clear for most people. Right. When you're engaged on social media, is your humanity expanded or collapsed? And generally speaking, the answers are not good. And so tech and its impact and its aspiration to change the world and save the world, like, we have to really kind of slow down and look at these, like the salvation. If we just get the lower right tech structures in place, everything's going to transform and be great. And it's quite the opposite right now.
That was the vision. I remember that was the vision they tried to sell us in the 1990s through things like Wired magazine, and how the internet was going to revolutionize democracy and make these like actual utopias sort of within arm's reach. And it had the exact opposite effect.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And just to bridge the lower left and the lower right, and I'm just super aware of people who are listening, and again, how overwhelming this can all feel when we start to double click, if you will, into these different dimensions, and then how elaborate each dimension actually is and what it would take for us to really start to transform. And as Gail Hachashka says, a colleague and friend of ours who will be on in December, who's doing a lot of research on climate, basically says it's, we're not, this isn't an adaptive challenge. We're not just adapting to climate change. We're actually engaging adaptively to transform society. And we have to ask the questions in the lower left that are really relevant, questions about ethics and about what it means to be a human society. And then those somehow have to be translated into the right-hand quadrant. It's not enough. From a tech perspective, it's one of the things I've been compelled about is, I don't know who brought it to my attention, but the fact that there is no ethical oversight, nor is there any ethical imperatives going into the programming.
Right.
So people aren't even educated in ethics. They're not educated in wisdom and in compassion. And so when it comes to programming, there's no feedback loop between the lower left and the lower right vis-a-vis ethics at all.
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit of a runaway train.
Yeah.
Not a little bit, a lot of a runaway train. And the profit motive itself needs to be challenged in a particular way. And in some, corporate circles, some of these things are changing. People are starting to consider shareholders rather than just stakeholders, and they're looking at impacts and profit around the ecosystem of the corporation. So some of that is happening. I think we can, there is a bit of an upside to the lower left too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the lower right and all these big systems, but they're so massive and they're so intertwined with each other that it is really daunting. So people like Ken, who's just a crazy, great systems thinker, is really, really important. For me, I'm really good in getting a room full of people to be able to talk and to leave feeling good. But I'm not good at thinking big picture. Ken is incredible at thinking big picture. I need people in my life like Ken, like Gail, like Rob, like you, that help me do that, because it's not something that I do well on my own at all. It's like we really have to start, it's almost like cell differentiation. We have to get much more sophisticated around what our respective gifts and talents are, because somebody like Muhammad Yunus just hasn't, just instinctively understands how to deal with scale. And I don't, I don't know how to put a cell phone in the hand of every woman in a little town in Bangladesh. Like, that just doesn't even occur to me.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to this. I'm trying to find an upside.
Well, I mean, you did one.
I got scared of AI all of a sudden just now. I got scared of the tech monsters coming to get me, and I am scared of the tech monsters.
I am too. And at the end of the day, like I said earlier, I kind of have this suspicion that a benevolent dictatorship is going to be our only way out of this. And I think the only possible benevolent dictator we can have is an AI. So maybe we just need to put artificial intelligence in charge of this whole shebang, and that's how we climb our way out of this pit.
Yeah, it'd be cool to dump like the world's 12 most beautiful mystic poets and the great ethicists and the spiritual leaders into one identity.
Yeah.
And let that identity decide these things.
Yeah. And Diane, you mentioned how some corporations are sort of naturally evolving to become, sort of values-based corporations, and that's good to see. And meanwhile, story just came out last week. Yeah, Jeff Bezos is opening a homeless shelter for his own employees, which is about as like Blade Runner
weird
level feudalism as I can imagine. Weird. It's a boring dystopia, is what a lot of people call this. And speaking of Blade Runner, last month, Diane, but while we're still in the lower right quadrant, last month we were talking about the Tesla truck.
We're freaking ourselves out, everybody. I just want you to know that if I take the meta perspective on what we're doing right now we're in a tech freak out. I'm having certain kinds of internal experiences. The group is feeling certain things, and we'll just label it tech freak out, and that'll let us all relax. So keep going, Corey.
Well, let's get hopeful again. So we were talking last month about you were talking. I think it was your brother or your brother-in-law. I can't remember which it was, but you were talking about the new Tesla truck that's coming out, and you were saying that this is an opportunity to build some new kinds of bridges.
I think I wasn't actually talking about Tesla, because I don't think my brother would buy a Tesla, but I think Ford is putting out a half-ton pickup that's it's electric.
Okay, that's what it was. Okay.
It's an electric one that's coming out. But yeah, you want to talk about the new Tesla truck, speaking of high tech. So go ahead.
Well, I think it's sexy.
Why do you want one?
Well, I want one because I've never been a car guy, but for some reason Teslas like really make me lean in. I just think they're beautiful machines. You know, it's kind of like an Apple. One of the things I really love about Apple hardware is just like on a purely
The
aesthetic
aesthetic.
level,
Yes,
you know,
absolutely.
and then you get into the ethics behind it all, and you know, okay, that resonates with me too. So I really like Tesla as a line because they're doing something different, and I think they're doing it in a very, you know, as charitably as they possibly can while still being, you know, sustainable. So I was really excited when the Tesla truck came out, and you know, I mean, there's been massive memes created about this thing in the last couple of weeks, including like it looks like a video game graphic from 1991, which it, you know, kind of does, sort of de-resed.
We're talking about the problem of consumerism, and we all want a new Tesla.
Well, you know,
That's great.
hey,
I don't. Yeah.
but I love this thing. I mean,
Rob
it
has
looks-
one. I mean, he doesn't have the truck, but knowing Rob, he will have it soon. But you know, he has a Tesla car, right?
Yeah, you have a Tesla, Rob?
Yeah,
Oh,
I've been driving all over the place in it.
and do you love
Yeah,
it?
I'm similar to you. You described me. I'm not a car guy, and I'm absolutely in love with my Tesla. It's incredible.
Yeah,
But everybody's mad at Elon Musk for launching all those satellites and ruining the night sky.
Yeah,
You guys know that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how
So-
much was the night sky already ruined? That's what I'm thinking. We've already got a lot of light pollution in this world. I don't think a couple of satellites above there is really gonna add much to it. But guys, I just want to say
That is a really funny statement. Oh, how much was the night sky already ruined?
Whatever. Every
Sorry,
galaxy is moving away from every other galaxy. We're not going to be able to see each other in a few billion years anyway. Who cares?
Jeez, you're hilarious.
That is really funny, Corey.
Some
By the way, you guys,
cosmological-
it's really important when we go through the quadrants to laugh, because
this is how I grieve, Diane.
laughter arises. It's tetra arising. Humor is tetra arising.
That's right. So I just want to say, I think the Tesla truck is sexy. I look forward to driving it to the next moon base, because that's exactly what it looks like. I mean, it looks like something that, you know, you buy for your house on the moon. As a fan of brutalist aesthetics and dystopian science fiction and you know, all of that, I love the Tesla truck. I think it's beautiful, ugly.
Beautiful,
and
ugly.
To Elon's point, you know, that trucks here in the United States is one of the most popular vehicles.
Yep.
You know, and I just left Wyoming, and that's truck country. You know?
I'm going with my half-ton electric Ford.
Yeah, and if we are going to become more sustainable like that, we need a vehicle, and we need to, you know, accelerate the getting away from the combustion engine, which is, you know, it converts, I think, less than 60% of the energy into movement. So almost half of it is lost to heat.
Right.
You know, it's like, would you spend your money like where you just lost half of it whenever you did a transaction, you know, or 60% efficiency, you know? Anyway.
They're capitalists, they're anti-capitalists, and then they're just losers. And I'm in the third category.
Yeah. That's hilarious. Well, I want to come back to kind of like my optimism, if I can, just for a couple of minutes. But I'm in agreement with Stein on this one, is that the largest untapped potential on planet Earth is us. So the greatest resource that hasn't been leveraged, it is human potential. And our salvation is there. It is in really getting curious about what we're capable of together. If we really invest our resources and organize culture and civilization around bringing forth our greater uniqueness and our greater potential, that can be good for the civic commons. You know, and I mean that not just in a human civic commons, but our collective commons in the biosphere, on this planet, right? And that is what gets me inspired and gets me excited.
Does that make you rethink governance structures, which are lower right too? I know Corey was just talking about a benevolent dictator. What are you thinking about governance?
Well, ways of making sense of the diversity of perspectives requires supercomputers and perhaps AI, right? That can both source and aggregate our collective sense making and meaning making, right? What's happening? Why? What should we do? And to start to kind of curate that into ways that we can actually palette it, and that certain parts of the data gets funneled to various people who have expertise in those areas, and that those people continue to make decisions, right? And
Can I just ask a question? I mean,
sure.
apparently that is already happening. You know, it's happened in the elections, right? With the Russian interference in the election. How do you get that influence in the hands of the right people?
I'm so it hasn't happened in the elections, at least what I'm describing, which is an open inquiry into what is really going on, right? So for us to actually ask questions, what's going on, what's happening, what are our biggest challenges, where are pain points, what's most beautiful, what are we most aspiring towards, and for us to have that input into governance structures. Right now we just have kind of like topics, but for those things to get aggregated and conducted in creative ways, which probably does involve some serious computing tech, right? That then gives a community, it could be an entire nation, it could be just a city, it could be an organization that looks at, hey, you know, this is what's up and what do we want to do about it, right? And then we have real dialogues, and then, you know, the people who are responsible for this particular area of expertise, they're the decision makers, you know. And does that make sense? And it's different than kind of the interference, which is kind of profiling people and kind of, it's not asking, it's trying to figure out what are the levers to manipulate and exploit people. And this is the opposite. It's like, what do you want? What do you need? What's of value to you? Where do you really want to go? And for governance to respond to those inputs, we just, you know, we're currently electing people, you know, that supposedly represent these kind of broad sections. What if we didn't have to do that? You know?
Right.
So what if we didn't have to elect a single individual, but there's a whole bunch of people that we elect to take care of this particular issue or to represent this part, right? And that they're going to be actively working with our inquiries and our inputs. And that's a very different thing, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, Rob, I think when we have these conversations and we talk about, you know, you brought up human potential as sort of this, the largest untapped resource that we have. And it's something I totally agree with, both individually and collectively. So I think it's pretty obvious when we're talking about individual hold-ons, that, you know, we always recommend that people do their best to try to reconcile all these different sort of polarities that we feel conflict around. So it's a good idea for an individual to be fairly balanced when it comes to something like your individual rights versus your civic duties, for example, or your interiors and your exteriors. There's any number of sort of dualities we can throw on the table right now that seems like fairly common sense that on an individual level, we want to sort of wrap our minds and wrap our hearts around. I think the same is true of social hold-ons. I think there are a number of just critical polarities that a healthy social hold-on requires. And that itself requires sort of a meta paradigmatic sort of ability to enact all of these different systems simultaneously and fold them together into what you described earlier as civilization building. So there's a place for capitalism. There's a place for socialism. There's a place for sort of bottom up mechanisms, and there's a place for top down mechanisms. There's a place for all of these. And in fact, I think it's becoming increasingly essential that we begin to look more closely at these polarities, such as, for example, between capitalism and socialism, right? So I often describe myself, I'm a Maslow socialist. What that means is I want to socialize all the bottom rungs of Maslow's hierarchy: food, shelter, safety, etc. And I want to capitalize the mid to late rungs. And when it comes to the highest rungs, neither capitalism nor socialism even touch that to begin with. But this is sort of a way of describing a system that has a healthy balance between all of these sort of different paradigms of self-organization, and bringing them all together to say, okay, well, this pattern of self-organization is really, really good at solving these kinds of problems. Socialism is great, for example, for, you know, bringing the bottom floor up. Capitalism is great for bringing the ceiling up. The problem is when you only do one without the other, you're either going to bring the ceiling up and destroy the floor, or you're going to bring the floor up and you're going to lower the ceiling for everyone else. And those are, I think, sort of the binaries that people find themselves trapped between. And I think one of the things I really value about an integral consciousness is it allows us to have a more nuanced conversation about all of these simultaneously, and then figure out how they might maybe be able to start fitting into each other in a more cohesive way than we have today.
Yeah.
Amen, brother.
So upper right.
Well, I think we have to make a decision because I have a hard stop at 4:30. And so Gail Hachashka is going to join us at the end of December. And I know she has a lot to say about the upper right. So we could leave the upper right till next time and open up to questions, or we could go ahead and proceed, but we're not going to have a whole lot of time to.
Well, let's do this because it's always
Okay.
hard to predict how many questions we're going to get. So let's
Okay,
open it up for
great.
questions right now. We can spend a
Okay.
couple minutes talking about the upper right, maybe, and then if questions come up, we'll shift over. Does that sound
That
good?
sounds great. Absolutely.
Okay, so let me give everyone sort of the spiel here. So again, if you are watching right now on integrallife.com/live, there's a link right underneath this video player. If you click that, it'll bring you into the Zoom app, which is a free app for you to download. That's where you need to be if you want to ask us questions. So once you're in the Zoom app, you have two ways you can do that. You can either hit the raise my hand button, which tells us you have a question and you'd like us to turn on your camera and your audio, and we can have a nice conversation. Or you can hit the Q&A button and submit a question that way. And we'll just read it on the air and go from there. So I'll give these guys sort of a few minutes to see if anything comes up. Sometimes some shows, nothing comes up because everyone is just so happy, whole, and complete with what we said that nothing's arising for them. I always take that as a compliment.
Great.
So while we wait, upper right, and I think this is a good place to end. I wanted to save this because this has to do, the upper right quadrant is like, okay, so we can talk about human potential. We can talk about, you know, sort of these cultural developments and these social developments and technological developments at what we want to see happen. But really it all comes down to behavior. What are you going to do? What is one thing that you can do right after this call that makes you feel like you're actually putting your hand on the wheel somehow? So I feel like this is an opportunity for us to be a little bit hopeful.
Yeah, me too.
And we do have a hand raised, so let's get through it in a few minutes. So Diane, restore our hope in 3 minutes, and then we'll go to our question.
Well, everything that you value and care about in the upper left, you can learn how to express and engage. So for me, communication skills and relational skills related to this conversation are really important. So one would be really learning how to work with your own nervous system when we talk about being triggered or when fight or flight is aroused, and how to actually learn to calm yourself so that when you're in conversations, you can sit through those moments of arousal and being triggered and wait until the next breath. You can learn to listen well. You can also express yourself in ways that are not dominant submission structures, but are actually filled with inquiry and connection and warmth. And so I would just kind of lead by saying that, you know, learn how to listen and express most. You got to have the conversations about this. Important that we're talking. So having an ante up in terms of skills and behaviors.
Beautiful. So yeah, skill development is central to this, and us admitting to ourselves that we still have skills that we need to develop. Yeah, that's huge. And I would add, if you're, you know, watching this conversation and you're the type of person who can make sense of all this stuff that we're throwing at you right now, you really should be voting. You really should be voting. There's absolutely no excuse for anyone who has an integral consciousness to not vote. I don't care who you vote for. I don't care what you vote for. Please vote.
Please vote.
Yep. Rob, do you have anything to say before we turn over to questions?
Rob's fasting. He's eating less meat.
Totally. Yeah. I've been doing intermittent fasting. But, you know, and I never really connected the dots until Diane and I were teaching this course on climate change, and we were looking at meditation, and I started just seeing just how radical it is. when you take your Zazen posture or whatever meditation posture you do, I mean, most notably, you're just sitting now. So in terms of having less impact, your respiration goes down. Like literally, you produce less carbon. You consume less energy, right? And so there's something really profound about just sitting, shikantaza, just sitting, without any activity, without expending any agency, just sit, right? And so that's one thing that I would say is very simple and very accessible, not as easy to do,
Right.
because of the inherent gravity and momentum.
Yeah.
Right. But if we really want to get into the I would say source code of what are we and what can we become, you can't answer those questions from any of the motions that you're typically involved in.
Yeah.
You'll just simply perpetuate. So if you want an enlightened answer to those questions, right, that breaks free of the dualisms and the physical monisms that dominate every facet of our world, sit.
It's beautiful. Yeah. The more urgency we feel, the more we need to infuse it with silence, really, and find that ground. That's beautiful. All right, let's bring Marjorie on over. So Marjorie has a question. Read her over, read her over. Bring Marjorie on over. And when she gets here, I will turn on her microphone. Hi, Marjorie.
Here we go. Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're kind of sideways, but
Sideways. Let me see if will that work?
there we go.
Is that better?
There you are.
Marjorie, we like
Okay.
you right side up and sideways.
Oh, that's cool. Thank you. Yes, everything you've been talking about for this hour has just been things that I've been working with. In particular, this past year, taking a course with Terry Patton based on his
good.
book, A New Republic of the Heart.
Great.
And we're coming to the end of the year, and we're sort of doing an evaluation, and how did we do, and what's next, and so a lot of these things that you've been talking about are exactly what we're coming out with. It's like, yes, there are many people who have really become engaged in individual projects and even projects together, and then there are some of us who feeling almost like a failure, like, what do? We don't know what to do. We don't know how to reach people, especially in our local communities. And so all of this paradox that you're talking about, is just really what we have. I say the we space, from my perspective anyway, is just really not really having a definite answer after a year of working with these questions. And so we just go on, and but some of the things that you talked about today was like here we are from our perspective working towards the common good, and I would say that there are other people who are meeting online and in groups from their perspective, thinking that they're doing good, but they're coming from the exact opposite agenda. And how do we from those of us who have a capacity to be able to tap into other worldviews, how can we find what is partially true from the opposite agenda, or from people who are climate change deniers, people who are, we talk about wanting to see, a whole group of benevolent dictators. Well, then there are those who would love to see a whole group of not so benevolent dictators.
Correct.
Which is what we're seeing in the world. So, kind of living this paradox of what is good, what is evil, what is just tapping into not knowing also, and so there's just so many questions that we've been working with, and it's fascinating. And I'm so glad that you're doing this, and that I'm involved with all of this, even though I feel like I'm sort of one of the ones who's sort of come to some sort of conclusion that based on a lot of different things with my age, my personality, my life situation, the circumstances, said I'm not going to be able to do a whole lot out there in the world. So, and I've always just been one of the ones that's been sort of behind the scenes and being the one who is behind the ones who are out there doing that, doing all the activity. I'm the one who's doing all the other stuff in the background to support them as they are doing the work. So,
thank you, Marjorie. And I totally relate with that. That's how I have self-identified for years. You know, I've often said I don't want to stand on stages. I want to build them for people like Rob and Diane to stand on. And that's been, you know, sort of a big driver for me in terms of the work that I do. And Diane, I'm wondering if you or Rob actually have anything to respond to Marjorie, especially when she's talking about trying, you know, just the efforts to find common ground with people who, again, enact this problem in very, very different ways than we probably do.
Well, I would just say, Marjorie, first of all, what I heard you say is that you've been in a very deep inquiry for a year, and you've been looking careful at these questions with a group of people that are similarly inclined, and that you haven't come to any kind of conclusions that have freed you from the pain of it, and that in a certain way that even though you've engaged it, the dilemma is still what it is. And also that even as we're working in this moment to try to enact what we consider to be our highest and best good, others have very different views about what is good, and from our perspective might be seen as malevolent or destructive. And how do we actually work with, and in what way do we work? And I heard your role is to lend support and stability to those people who are maybe a little bit more on the lines. And I guess what I would say to you is that, to me, as I'm listening to you, I hear you engaged in a spiritual and ethical practice. And the not knowing mind but the openness, the open-heartedness, and the commitment to your own value set, in spite of all these obstacles, is where it's at. And the question always becomes, for anyone who's, you know, if nothing else, the world demands that we ante up according to what we really care about. And that's, from one perspective, as good as it gets. You know, we've never really been able to count on an outcome other than our own enactment of our own values is where it's at. And that's what I hear you saying you're doing. So.
Wow, thank you, Diane. You are just brilliant at being able to speak back to me what I shared, and I really thank you for being able to do that. And I think I also will say that, and I don't want to monopolize if there's other people that need to speak, because I know we're running out of time. Just that paradox, and just that being willing to, in a way, sort of see the whole thing about the climate change, and you know, in similar terms as I see my own immortality or mortality, or should I say mortality, because a lot of the same kinds of questions from the collective is what we each need to eventually do in our own lives about, you know, we will not go on in this form forever, you know.
That's
and
right.
So, yeah.
That's for sure. And also, I would just love to give you the experience of my support for your engagement and activity, because I heard you say that you give others support, and I feel just what you described is really valuable, and I just want to give you a shout out and also give you some support to continue.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marjorie. All right,
Thank
so looks like we have another 8 minutes or so, and someone else has their hand raised. Elaine, I'm going to bring you on over. Oh, here he comes. Let's unmute.
I have a double
because a lot of the same kinds of questions
sound here.
Up, hang on a sec. It sounds like someone might have the video playing in the background.
About,
No,
you know, we will
was
not go on in
actually
this form.
Marjorie still talking.
Forever,
I don't know.
you know.
I'm on
That's
two
right.
different
So,
channels,
yeah,
but
That's for sure.
Yeah, Elaine, I'm gonna mute you real quick. If you have the other player open where you were watching this originally, I think that might be seeping through. So sometimes we get these feedback loops if people have the player. So I'm gonna unmute you now and see if maybe it's better.
For it to continue.
Thank
Okay.
you so much. Thank you.
No.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Elaine, we can hear you, but I'm still getting this feedback loop. Are you playing the webinar someplace in your browser right now?
Yeah.
Elaine, I'm gonna bring you on over.
Oh gosh.
We're in some ulterior.
I was going to say, oh my God, it's a tech nightmare. It's like our, all our karma is immediately available to us. We get to see every.
Someone might have a video playing. Okay, Elaine, I'm gonna mute you for now. And then see if you can turn off your the stream that this is coming through right now.
Yeah. Elaine, I'm gonna mute you real quick.
Yeah, that
The
didn't work.
choice making, Rob, you get to see your choices enacted, and then you get to decide again whether you really want to do it.
Right.
And I've got Rob Smith texting me right now to tell me how nerve-wracking this must be. So I'm glad you're watching, Rob. So I'm going to bring Indigo. I'm going to bring Indigo back on real quick. Elaine, we'll see if we can get that solved, and we'll bring you on as well. But right now, we're going to bring Indigo over. You are unmuted. Hi, Indigo.
Hi, everyone. Ashley here. Hi.
Ashley. Nice to
Hey,
see you.
Ashley.
Hey, Ashley Hennard. I'm starting a YouTube channel for integral wellness. I talk a lot on vitamins and just living a healthy lifestyle. But one of my questions today, which I already posted, and you guys are all doing a great job, by the way. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you.
Has anyone been in touch with Elon Musk regarding the integral community and what we're up to? And
As far as I know, no. It's something I've wanted to do for a long time, but honestly, I don't know how to go about it. Rob, did you have something to say about that?
Yeah, there are some back channels that are happening there.
Ooh.
okay.
But I'm to what degree the integral kind of landscape has been articulated to him, I don't know yet. I don't know the answer to that. But definitely there's been some conversations had. And Elon, for better or for worse, is very transactional in his exchanges, and is very how to put this. I don't have this first person experience, so this is kind of, take it with a grain of salt. But that's like, he's incredibly gifted at kind of seeing the system and kind of just marching forward, often at the expense of relationship. Right?
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what I'm kind of hearing through the grapevine. But there are pockets that are in conversation with him.
Okay.
What's your interest in him, in his hearing about the integral view?
So I just know that he makes waves, right? When he gets an idea, he really runs with it. And so if there's any way that he might want to contribute to the thinking on this topic or these topics, to the collective works that are being produced, or even just to contribute to the projects that are being promoted, I think he would be an asset in that way. But I know that he can tend to be challenging relationally, as I've noticed that just from a distance. But yeah, I don't know. For all I know, there's somebody in this community who can really speak to him and who he can relate to, or whatever the case. So thanks for answering that question for me. I am, like I said, I'm just starting a channel on YouTube, Ashley Hennard. That's Henard. I was part of the San Diego integral community. I just moved back to Las Vegas. So unfortunately, I'm not able to see everyone there, but if you guys happen to know anyone here in Las Vegas, please let me know. I'd love to meet up with them.
Nice.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Ashley. Yeah, I would love to build that bridge with Elon. I just think he's one of these guys. He's obviously coming from minimally a teal altitude, at least in some of his lines of development, right? You know, I like how he is sort of systematizing his values. I like how he is making his technological innovations available to other people so that they can, you know, in turn bring it more fully into the world. And I do think there would be a natural resonance there. So Elon, if you're watching right now, get in touch, man.
Elon, if you're watching, I want some of those solar roof tiles.
Seriously. Maybe a Tesla truck to sweeten the deal. Well, Diane, I know you've got, you know, just like 2 minutes left. We can close now. We do have one more person with their hand raised. Should we try to get to it real quick, or should we?
I think so, and I can transition off, and you guys can finish.
Okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
let's
it's
do it.
Elaine again. So Elaine, we're going to give you another shot here. Bring on over. Hopefully all the feedback loops have been remedied.
Can you hear me now?
Hello, Elaine.
Yes.
I can hear you and not us. So
Yes.
I take that as a good sign.
Yes. Okay. Just a quick one. I would like to know whether you're planning a follow-up to this, bringing in the levels of consciousness. Because
Yes,
I
yes,
just
on the next December 28th. That's
want-
exactly levels. It's all levels.
because
Yep.
the levels will make a big difference in a way.
Absolutely. That's exactly what we're going to be doing, and our guest will be Gail Hachatska. So we're totally going to do that.
You're speaking a T language as I hear it, but I think it may be even more useful to make it more visible. That because
Okay.
so many people are locked in other levels of consciousness cannot see the whole thing.
Okay, great. Well, let's
Definitely
have that
do that.
conversation. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah. And Elaine, I hope you can join us next month for that conversation and ask some good questions.
December 28th, I will.
December 28th. Yep.
Awesome.
you.
Levels, everybody, December
Sorry for the
28th.
trouble.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. for
Yeah.
being on the
Thank you
call.
guys so much. This has been such an awesome show. I love
It's
you
always a
both.
pleasure.
Love you too. Bye-bye.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Love you guys. Thanks, brother.
Yeah. Thank you, man. This was a lot of fun. I'll talk to you soon. Let's have
Yeah.
lunch or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be back in town that week of the 9th.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Well, let's get together.
Yeah, I'd
because
love
it's
to
been-
love
it's
to
been too
hang.
long.
It's been way too long.
I know. All right, dude. I'll talk to you soon, man.
Love you, man.
Bye.
Bye.